Hello guys, and welcome back to Leah's Lifestyle. We're at it again with part 2 for the Berkshire Hathaway 1986 letter to shareholder. Where we left off here was in the insurance section. So let's continue where we were at. Our own insurance operation did well in 1986 and is also likely to do well in 1987. We have benefited significantly from industry conditions, much of our prosperity arises from the efforts and ability of Mike Goldberg, manager of all insurance operations. Our combined ratio on statutory basis and excluding structured settlements and financial reinsurances fell from 111 in 1985 to 103 in 1986. In addition, our primary growth has been exceptional. Although final figures aren't available, I believe that over the past 2 years, we were the fastest growing company among the country's top 100 insurers. Some of our growth, it is true, came from our large quota share contract with Fireman's Fund, described in last year's report and updated in Charlie's letter on page 54, but even if the premiums from the contract are excluded from the calculations, we probably still ranked first in growth. Interestingly, we were the slowest growing large insurer in the year immediately preceding 1985. In fact, we shrank and we will do so again from time to time in the future. Our large swing in volume do not mean that we come and go from the insurance marketplace. Indeed, we are its most steadfast participant, always standing ready, at prices we believe adequate, to write a wide variety of high limited coverages. The swing in our volume arises instead from the here today, gone tomorrow behavior of other insurances. When most insurers are gone because their capital is inadequate or they have been frightened by losses, insurers rush to us and find us ready to do business. But when hordes of insurers are quote-unquote here, we are slashing prices far below expectable costs. Many consumers naturally leave us in order to take advantage of the bargains temporarily being offered by our competitors. Our firmness on price works no hardship on the consumer. He is being bombarded by attractively priced insurances offers at those times when we are doing little business, and it works no hardship on our employees. We don't engage in layoffs when we experience a cycle slowdown. At one of our generally profitable insurance operations, this is no layoff practice. This is our self-interest. Employees who fear that large layoffs will accompany sizable reductions in premium volume will understandably produce scads of business through thick and thin, mostly thin. The trends in national indemnities, traditional business, the writings of commercial auto and general liability policies through general agents suggest how gun-shy other insurers became for a while and how brave they are now getting. In the last quarter of 1985, NICO's monthly volume averaged 5 million, about what it had been running for several years. By the first quarter of 1986, monthly volume had climbed to about 35 million. In recent months, a sharp decline has set in. Monthly volume is currently about 20 million and will continue to fall as new competitors surface and prices are cut. Ironically, the managers of certain major new competitors are the very same managers that just a few years ago bankrupt insurers that were our old competitors. Through state-mandated guaranteed funds, we must pay some of the losses these managers left unpaid, and now we find them writing the same sort of businesses under a new name, Cist la Guerre. Some French there. The businesses we call quote-unquote large risks expanded significantly during 1986 and will be important to us in the future. In this operation, we regularly write policies with annual premiums of $1 to $3 million or even higher. this business will necessarily be highly volatile, both in volume and profitability. But our premier capital position and willingness to write large net lines make us a very strong force in the market when prices are right. On the other hand, our structured settlement businesses has become near dormant because present prices make no sense to us. In 1986, loss reserve development of our insurance group is chronicled on page 46. The figure shows the amount of error in our year-end 1985 liabilities that a year of settlement and further evaluation has revealed. As you can see, what I told you last year about our lost liabilities was far from true, and that makes 3 years in a row of error. If our philosophical rules that applied to Pinocchio were to apply to me, my nose would now draw crowds. When insurance executives belatedly establish proper reserves, they often speak of quote-unquote reserve strengthening, a term that has a rather noble ring to it. They almost make it sound as if they are adding extra layers of strength to an already solid balance sheet. That's not the case. Instead, the term is an euphemism for what should more properly be called quote-unquote correction of previous untruths. I'll bet non-intentional ones. We made a special effort at the end of 1986 to reserve accurately. However, we tried just as hard at the end of 1985. Only time will tell whether we have finally succeeded in correctly estimating our insurance liabilities. Despite the difficulties we've had in reserving and the commodity economics of the industry, we expect our insurance business to both grow and make significant amounts of money. Both progress will be distinctly irregular, and there will be major unpleasant surprises from the time to time. It's a treacherous business, and a wary attitude is essential. We must heed Woody Allen, quote, "While the lamb may lie down with the lion, the lamb shouldn't count on getting a whole lot of sleep," end quote. In our insurance operations, we have an advantage in attitude, we have an advantage in capital, and we are deploying an advantage in personnel. Additionally, I like to think we have some long-term edge in investing in the float developed from policyholder funds. The nature of the business suggests that we will need all of these advantages in order to prosper. Geico Corporation, 41% owned by Berkshire, and the outstanding year in 1986. Industry-wide, underwriting experience in personal lines did not improve nearly as much as it did in the commercial lines. But Geico, writing personal lines almost exclusively, improved its combined ratio to 96.9 and recorded a 16% gain in premium volume. Geico also continued to repurchase its own shares and ended the year with 5.5 fewer shares outstanding than it had in the start of the year. Our share of Geico's premium volume is over 500 million, close to double that of only 3 years ago. Geico's book of business is one of the best in the world of insurance, far better indeed than Berkshire's own books. The most important ingredient in Geico's success in rock-bottom operating costs, which set the company apart from literally hundreds of competitors that offer auto insurance. The total of Geico's underwriting expenses and loss adjustment expenses in 1986 was only 23.5% of premiums. Many major companies show percentages 15 points higher than that. Even such huge direct writers as Allstate and State Farm incur appreciably higher costs than does Geico. The difference between Geico's costs and those its competitors is a kind of moat that protects a valuable and much sought-after business castle. No one understands this moat around the castle concept better than Bill Seidner, chairman of Geico. He continually wades the moat by driving down costs still more, thereby defending and strengthening the economic franchise. Between 1985 and 1986, Geico's total expense ratio dropped from 24.1% to the 23.5% mentioned earlier, and under Bill's leadership, the ratio is almost certain to drop farther. If it does, and if Geico maintains its severance and underwriting standards, the company's future will be brilliant indeed. The second stage of Geico's rocket is fueled by Louis Simpson, vice chairman, who has run the company's investment since late 1979. Indeed, it's a little embarrassing for me, the fellow responsible for investment at Berkshire, to chronicle Lou's performance at Geico. Only my ownership of a controlled block of Berkshire stock makes my secure enough to give you the following figures, comparing the overall return of the equity portfolio at Geico to that of the Standard & Poor's 500. Year, and we go from 80, 81, 82, 83, 84, 85, and 86, and then it has a Geico's equity and S&P 500. So, 80, 23.7% for Geico, 32.3% for 500 for the S&P, 81, year 81, 5.4% for Geico, negative 5% for S&P, 82, 45.8% for Geico, 21.4% for S&P, 83, 36% for Geico, 22.4% for S&P, 84, 21.8% for Geico, 6.2% for S&P, 85, 45.8% for Geico, 31.6% for S&P, 86, 38.7% for Geico, 18.6% for S&P. These are not only terrific figures, but fully as important, they have been achieved in the right way. Louis has consistently invested in undervalued common stock that, individually, were unlikely to present him with a permanent loss and that, collectively, were close to risk-free. In sum, Geico is an exceptional business ran by exceptional managers. We are fortunate to be associated with them. Marketable securities. During 1986, our insurance companies purchased about 700 million of tax-exempt bonds, most having a maturity of 8 to 12 years. You might think that this comment indicates a considerable enthusiasm for such bonds. Unfortunately, that's not so. At best, the bonds are mediocre investments. They simply seemed the least objectable alternative at the time we bought them, and still seem so. Currently, liking neither stock nor bonds, I find myself the polar opposite of Mae West as she declared, quote, "I like only two kinds of men, foreign and domestic," end quote. We must, of necessity, hold marketable securities in our insurance companies, and, as money comes in, we have only 5 directions to go. 1. Long-term common stock investment. 2. Long-term fixed income securities. 3. Medium-term fixed income securities. 4. Short-term cash equivalents. And 5. Short-term arbitrage commitments. Common stock, of course, are the most fun. When conditions are right, that is, when companies with good economics and good management sell well below intrinsic business value, stocks sometimes provide grand slam home runs. But we currently find no equities that come close to meeting our tests. This statement in no way translates into a stock market prediction. We have no idea and never have had whether the market is going to go up, down, or sideways in the near or intermediate term future. What we do know, however, is that occasional outbreaks of those two super contagious diseases, fear and greed, will forever occur in the investment community. The timing of these epidemics will be unpredictable, and the market apparitions produced by them will be equally unpredictable, both as to determinant and degree. Therefore, we never try to anticipate the arrival or departure of either disease. Our goal is more modest. We simply attempt to be fearful when others are greedy, and to be greedy only when others are fearful. As this is written, little fear is visible in Wall Street. Instead, euphoria prevails. And why not? What could be more exhilarating than to participate in a bull market in which the reward to owners of businesses becomes gloriously uncoupled from the plodding performance of the business themselves? Unfortunately, however, stocks can't outperform businesses indefinitely. Indeed, because of the heavy transaction and investment management costs they bear, stockholders as a whole and over the long term must inevitably underperform the companies they own. If American businesses, in aggregate, earns about 12% on equity annually, investors must end up earning significantly less. Bull markets can obscure mathematic laws, but they cannot repel them. The second category of investment open to our insurance companies as long-term bonds, these are unlikely to be of interest to us except in very special situations, such as the Washington Public Power Supply System number 1, number 2, and number 3 issues, discussed in our 1984 report. At year-end, we owned WPPSS issues having an amortized cost of $218 million and a market value of $310 million, paying us $31.7 million in annual tax-exempt income. Our aversion to long-term bonds relates to our fear that we will see much higher rates of inflation within the next decade. Over time, the behavior of our currency will be determined by the behavior of our legislator. This relationship poses a continuing threat to currency stability and a corresponding threat to the owners of long-term bonds. We continue to periodically employ money in the arbitrage field. However, unlike most arbitrageurs who purchase dozens of securities each year, we purchase only a few. We restrict ourselves to large deals that have been announced publicly and do not bet on the come. Therefore, our potential profits are apart to be small, but with luck, our disappointments will also be few. Our year-end portfolio shown below includes our arbitrage comments. Lear Schindler, our balance sheet also includes a receivable for $145 million, representing the money owed us and paid a few days later by Unilever, then in the process of purchasing Chasebrook bonds, another one of our arbitrage holdings. Arbitrage is an alternative to treasury bills as a short-term parking place for money, a choice that combines potentially higher returns with higher risks. To date, our return from the funds committed to our arbitrage have been many times higher than they would have been had we left those funds in treasury bills. Nothing less. One bad experience could change the scorecard markedly. We also, though it takes some straining, currently view medium-term tax-exempt bonds as an alternative to short-term treasury holdings. Buying those bonds, we run a risk of significant loss if, as seems probable, we sell many of them well before maturity. However, we believe this risk is more than counterbalanced first by the much higher after-tax returns currently realizable from these securities as compared to treasury bills, and second, by the possibility that sales will produce an overall profit rather than a loss. Our exception of a higher total return after allowing for the possibility of loss and after taking into account all tax effects is a relative close call and could well be wrong. Even if we sell our bonds at a fairly large loss, however, we may end up repaying a higher after-tax return than we would have realized by repeatedly rolling over treasury bills. In an event, you should know that our expectation for both the stock and bonds we now hold are exceptionally modest given current market levels. Probably the best thing we could happen to us is a market in which we would choose to sell many of our bond holdings at a significant loss in order to reallocate funds to the far better equity values than very likely to exist. The bond losses I am talking about would occur if high interest rates came along. The same rates would probably depress common stock considerably more than medium-term bonds. We show below our 1986 year-end net holdings in marketable equities. All positions with a market value of over $25 million are listed, and the interest in attributable to minority shareholdings of Wesco Financial Corp. And Nebraska Furniture Mart are excluded. And it has the shares on the left, the names of the company, which are Capital Cities, ABC Inc., Geico Corporation, Handy and Harum, Lear Singular Inc., and the Washington Post companies, cost and market. But we're just going to go over the total common stock. And for cost, it was $655,364. And for market, it was $1,875,033. We should note that we expect to keep permanently are three primary holdings: Capital City, ABC Inc., Geico Corporation, and the Washington Post. Even if these securities were to appear significantly overpriced, we would not anticipate selling them, just as we would not sell Seas or Buffalo Evening News if someone were to offer us a price far above what we believe those businesses were worth. This attitude may seem old-fashioned in a corporate world in which activity has become the order of the day. The modern manager refers to his quote-unquote portfolio of businesses, meaning that all of them are candidates for quote-unquote restructuring, whenever such a move is dictated by Wall Street preferences, operating conditions, or a new corporate quote-unquote concept. Restructuring is defined narrowly, however. It extends only to dumping offending businesses, not to dumping the officers and directors who bought the businesses in the first place. Quote, hate the sin but love the sinner, end quote, is a theology as popular with the Fortune 500 as it is with the Salvation Army. Investment managers are even more hyperkinetic. Their behavior during trading hours makes whirling dervishes appear sedent by comparison. Indeed, the term quote-unquote institutional investor is becoming one of those self-contradictions called an oxymoron, comparable to quote-unquote jumbo shrimp, quote-unquote lady mud wrestler, and quote-unquote inexpensive lawyer. Despite the enthusiasm for activity, what this wept business and financial America, we will stick with our till death do us part policies. It's the only one with which Charlie and I are comfortable. It produces decent results and it lets our managers and those of our investees run their businesses free of distraction. NHP Inc. Last year we paid $23.7 million for about 50% of NHP Inc.'s. A developer, syndicator, owner, and manager of multifamily rental housing. Should all executive stock options that have been authorized be granted and exercised, our equity interest will decline to slightly over 45%. NHP Inc. has a most unusual genealogy. In 1967, President Johnson appointed a commission of businesses and civic leaders led by Edgar Kaiser to study ways to increase the supply of multifamily housing for low and moderate income tenants. Certain members of the commission why can't I say this word? Subsequently formed and promoted two businesses entities to foster this goal. Both are now owned by NHP Inc. and one operates under usual ground rules. 3 of its directors must be appointed by the president with the advice and consent of the state, and it is also required by law to submit an annual report to the president. Over 206 major corporations, motivated more by the idea of public services than profit, invested $42 million in the 2 original entities, which promptly began through partnerships to develop government subsidiaries rental properties. The typical partnership owned a single property and was largely financed by a non-recourse mortgage. Most of the equity money for each partnership was supplied by a group of limited partners who were primarily attracted by the large tax deductions that went with the investments. NHP acted as general partner and also purchased a small portion of each partnership equity. The government's housing policy has, of course, shifted, and NHP has necessarily bordered its activities to include non-subsidized apartments, commanding market rate rents. In addition, a subsidiary of NHP builds single-family homes in the Washington, D.C. area, realizing revenues of about $550 million annually. NHP now oversees about 500 partnerships properties that are located in 40 states and districts of Colombia and Puerto Rico, and that includes about 80,000 housing units. The cost of these properties was more than $2.5 billion, and they have been well maintained. NHP directly manages about 55,000 of the housing units and supervises the management of the rest. The company's revenues from management are about $16 million annually and growing. In addition to the equity interest in purchase upon the formation of each partnership, NHP owns varying residual interests that come into play when properties are disposed of and distributions are made to the limiting partners. The residual on many of NHP's quote-unquote deep subsidies properties are unlikely to be of much value, but residuals on certain other properties could prove quite valuable, particularly if inflation should heat up. The tax-orientated syndication of properties to individuals has been halted by the Tax Reform Act of 1986. In the main, NHP is currently trying to develop equity positions or significant residual interests in non-subsidized rental properties of quality and size, typically 200 to 500 units. In projects of this kind, NHP usually works with one or more large institution investors or lenders. NHP will continue to seek to develop low and moderate income apartment housing, but will not likely meet success unless government policy changes. Besides ourselves, the large shareholders in NHP are Weyerhaeuser, whose interest is about 25%, and a management group led by Rod Heller, chief executive of NHP. About 60 major corporations also continue to hold small interests, none larger than 2%. Taxation. The Tax Reform Act of 1986 affected our various businesses in important and divergent ways. Although we find much to praise in the act, the net financial effect for Berkshire is negative. Our rate of increase in business value is likely to be less moderate, slower under the new law than under the old. The net effect of our shareholder is even more negative. Every dollar of increase in per share business value, assuming the increase is accompanied by an equivalent dollar gain in the market value of our Berkshire stock, will produce 72 cents of after-tax gain for our shareholders rather than the 80-cent produced under the old law. This result, of course, reflects the rise in the maximum tax rate on personal capital gains from 20 to 28%. Here are the main tax changes that affect Berkshire. The tax rate on corporate ordinary income is scheduled to decrease from 46% in 1986 to 34% in 1988. This change obviously affects us positively, and it also has a significant positive effect on two of our three major investees, Capital Cities ABC and the Washington Post Company. I say this knowing that over the years there has been a lot of fuzzy and often partisan commentary about who really pays corporate taxes, businesses or their customers. The argument, of course, has usually turned around tax increases, not decreases. Those people resisting increases in corporate rates frequently argue that corporations in reality pay none of the taxes levied on them, but instead act as a sort of economic pipeline, passing all taxes to customers. According to these advocates, any corporate tax increase will simply lead to higher prices that, for the corporation, offsets the increase. Having taken this position, proponents of the quote-unquote pipeline theory must also conclude that a tax decrease for corporations will not help profits but will instead flow through, leading to correspondingly lower prices for consumers. Conversely, others argue that corporations not only pay the taxes levied upon them, but absorb them also. Consumers, this school says, will be unaffected by changes in corporate rates. What really happens? When the corporate rate is cut, do Berkshire, the Washington Post, Cap Cities, etc., themselves soak up the benefits, or do these companies pass the benefits along to their consumers in the form of lower prices? This is an important question for investors and managers, as well as for policymakers. Our conclusion is that in some cases, the benefits of lower corporate taxes fall exclusively or almost exclusively upon the corporation and its shareholders, and that in other cases, the benefits are entirely or almost entirely passed through to the consumer. What determines the outcome is the strength of the corporation's business franchise and whether the profitability of that franchise is regulated. For example, when the franchise is strong and after-tax profits are regulated in a relatively precise manner, as is the case when electric utilities, changes in corporate tax rates are largely reflected in prices, not in profits. When taxes are cut, prices will usually be reduced in short order. When taxes are increased, prices will rise, though often not as promptly. A similar result occurs in a second arena. In the price competitive industries whose companies typically operate with very weak business franchises. In such industries, the free market, quote-unquote, regulates after-tax profits in a delayed and irregular but generally effective manner. The marketplace, in effect, performs much with the same function in dealing with the price competitive industry as the Public Utilities Commission does in dealing with electric utilities. In these industries, therefore, tax changes eventually affect prices more than profits. In the case of unregulated businesses blessed with strong finances, however, it is a different story. The corporation and its shareholders are then the major beneficiaries of tax cuts. These companies benefit from a tax cut much as the electric company would if it lacked a regulator to force down prices. Many of our businesses, both those who own in whole, in part, possess such franchises. Consistently, reduction in their taxes largely end up in our pockets rather than in the pockets of our consumers. While this may be impolitical to state, it is impossible to deny. If you are tempted to believe otherwise, think for a moment of the most able-brained surgeon or lawyer in your area. Do you really expect the fees of this expert, the local quote-unquote franchise holder, in his or her specialty to be reduced now that the top personal tax rate is being cut from 50% to 28%? Your joy at our conclusion that lower rates benefit a number of our operating businesses and investees should be severely tempered. However, by another of our convictions, scheduled 1988 tax rates, both individual and corporate, seem totally unrealistic to us. These rates will very likely bestow a physical problem on Washington that will prove incompatible with price stability. We believe, therefore, that ultimately, within, say, 5 years, either higher tax rates or higher inflation rates are almost certain to materialize, and it would not surprise us to see both. Corporate capital gains tax rates have been increased from 28% to 34%, effective in 1987. This change will have an important adverse effect on Berkshire because we expect much of our gain in business value in the future, as in the past, to arise from capital gains. For example, our three major investment holdings, Cap Cities, Geico, and Washington Post, at year-end had a market value of over $1.7 billion, close to 75% of the total net worth of Berkshire, and yet they deliver us only about $9 million in annual income. Instead, all three retain a very high percentage of their earnings, which we expect to eventually deliver us capital gains. The new law increases the rate for all gains realized in the future, including the unrealized gains that exist before the law was enacted. At year end, we had $1.2 billion of such unrealized gains in our equity investments. The effect of the new law in our balance sheet will be delayed because a GAAP rule stipulates that the deferred tax liability applicable to unrealized gains should be stated at last year's 28% tax rate rather than the current 34% rate. This rule is expected to change soon. The moment it does, about $73 million will disappear from our GAAP net worth and be added to the deferred tax account. Dividend and interest income received by our insurance companies will be taxed far more heavily under the new law. First, all corporations will be taxed at 20% of the dividends they received from other domestic corporations, up from 15% under the old law. Second, there is a change concerning the residual 80% that applies only to property/casualty companies. 15% of that residual will be taxed if the stock paying the dividends were purchased after August 7th, 1986. A third change, again applying only to property/casualty companies, concerns tax-exempt bonds. Interest on bonds purchased by insurers after August 7th, 1986 will only be 85% tax-exempt. The last two changes are very important. They mean that our income from the investments we make in future years will be significantly lower than would have been the case under the old law. My best guess is that these changes alone will eventually reduce the earning power of our insurance operations by at least 10% from what we could previously have expected. The new tax law also materially changes the timing of tax payments by property casualty insurance companies. One new rule requires us to discount our loss reserves in our tax returns, a change that will decrease deductions and increase taxable income. Another rule, to be phased in over 6 years, requires us to include 20% of unearned premium reserves in taxable income. Neither rule changes the amount of annual tax accrual in our reports to you, but each material accelerates the schedule of payments. That is, taxes formerly deferred will now be front-ended, a change that will significantly cut the profitability of our business. An analog will suggest the toll if, upon turning 21, you were required to immediately pay taxes on all income you were due to receive throughout your life. Both your lifetime wealth and your estate would be a small fraction of what they would be if all taxes on your income were payable only when you died. Attentive readers may spot an inconsistency in what we say. Earlier, discussing companies in price-competitive industries, we suggested that tax increases or reductions affected these companies relatively little, but instead are largely passed along to their customers. But now we are saying that the tax increases will affect profits of Berkshire's property/casualty companies, even though the operation is in an intensely price competitive industry. The reason this industry is likely to be exception to our general rule is that not all major insurers will be working with identical tax acquisitions. Important differences will exist for several reasons. A new alternative minimum tax will materially affect some companies, but not others. Certain major insurers have huge loss carry forwards that will largely shield their income from significant taxes for at least a few years, and the results of some large insurers will be folded into the consolidated returns of companies with non-insurance businesses. These disparate conditions will produce widely variant marginal tax rates in the property/casualty industry. That will not be the case, however, in most other price-competitive industries, such as aluminum, autos, and department stores, in which the major players will generally contend with similar tax acquisitions. The absence of common tax calculation for property casualty companies means that the increased tax falling in the industry will probably not be passed along to customers to the degree that would in a typical price competitive industry. Insurers, in other words, will themselves bear much of the new tax burden. A partial offset of these burdens is a quote-unquote fresh start adjustment that occurred on January 1st, 1987, when our December 31st, 1986 loss reserve figures were converted for tax purposes to the nearly required discount basis. In our reports to you, however, reserves will remain on exactly the same basis as the past, undiscounted except in special cases such as structured settlements. The net effect of the quote-unquote fresh start is to give us a double deduction. We will get a tax deduction in 1987 and future years for a portion of our incurred but unpaid insurance losses that have already been fully dedicated as cost in 1986 and earlier years. The increase in net worth that is produced by the change is not yet reflected in our financial statement. Rather, under present GAAP rules, which may be changed, the benefit will flow into the earnings statement and consequently into net worth over the next few years by way of reduced tax charges. We exempt the total benefits from the fresh start adjustment to be in the 40 million range. It should be noted, however, that this is a one-time benefit, whereas the negative impact of the other insurance-related tax changes is not only outgoing, but in important respects will becoming more severe as time passes. The general utility doctrine was repelled by the new tax law. That means that in 1987 and thereafter there will be a double tax on corporate liquidation, on the corporate level and on other shareholder levels. In the past, the tax at the corporate level could be avoided. If Berkshire, for example, were to be liquidated, which is most certainly won't be, shareholders would, under the new law, receive far less from the sales of our properties than they would have if the properties had been sold in the past, assuming identical prices in each sale. Though this outcome is theoretical in our case, the change in the law will very materially affect many companies. Therefore, it also affects our evaluation of prospective investments. Take, for example, producing oil and gas businesses, selected media companies, real estate companies, etc., that might wish to sell. The values that their shareholders can realize are likely to be significantly reduced simply because the general utilities doctrine has been repealed. Though the company's operating economics will not have changed adversely at all, my impression is that this important change in the law has not yet been fully comprehended by early investors or managers. This section of our report has been longer and more complicated than I would have liked, but the change in the law are many and important, particularly for property casualty insurers. As I have noted, the new law will hurt Berkshire result, but the negative impact is impossible to quantify with any precision. Miscellaneous. We bought a corporate jet last year. Wow, what a way to start that. We bought a corporate jet last year. What you have heard about such planes is true. They were very expensive and a luxury in a situation like ours where little travel to out-of-the-way places is required. And planes not only cost a lot to operate, they also cost a lot just to look at. Pre-tax costs of capital plus direct depreciation on a new 15 million plane probably runs $3 million annually. On our own plane, bought for $850,000 used, such cost runs close to $200,000 annually. Cognizant of such figures, our chairman, unfortunately, has in the past made a number of rather intemperate remarks about corporate jets. Accordingly, prior to our purchase, I was forced into my Galileo mode, I promptly experienced the necessary quote-unquote counter-revelation, and travel is now considerably easier and considerably costlier than it is in the past. Whether Berkshire will get its money's worth from the plane is an open question, but I will work at achieving some business triumph that I can, no matter how dubiously, attribute it to. I'm afraid Ben Franklin had my number. Said he, quote, so convenient a thing it is to be a responsible creature, since it enables one to find or make a reason for everything one has a mind to do, end quote. About 97% of our eligible shares participated in Berkshire 1986 shareholders designed contributions program. Contributions made through the program were $4 million, and 1,934 charities were recipients. We urge new shareholders to read the description of our designated contribution program that appears on page 58 and 59. If you wish to participate in future programs, we strongly urge that you immediately make sure that the shares are registered in the name of the actual owner, not the street name or nominee name. Shares not so registered on September 30th, 1987 will be ineligible for the 1987 program. Last year, almost 450 people attended our shareholders meeting, up from about 250 the year before, and from about a dozen 10 years ago. I hope you can join us on May 19th in Omaha. Charlie and I like to answer owner-related questions, and I can promise you that our shareholders will pose many good ones. Finishing up the questions may take quite a while. We had about 65 last year, so you should feel free to leave once your own have been answered. Last year, after the meeting, our shareholders from New Jersey and another from New York went to the Furniture Mart, where each purchased a $5,000 Oriental rug from Mrs. B. To be precise, they purchased rugs that might cost $10,000 elsewhere, for which they were charged about $5,000. Mrs. B was pleased but not satisfied, and she will be looking for you at the store after this year's meeting. Unless our shareholders top last year's record, I'll be in trouble. So do me and yourself a favor and go see her. Warren E. Buffett, Chairman of the Board, February 27th, 1987. If you find this on YouTube, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Hit that bell icon so that way you know every single time when I post, and leave a comment down below. How did you feel about these tax laws? Did you know any of them? Do you know if any of them have changed since this time? I'm probably going to do a little research after I take notes and figure that out myself. And come back for number 3, where we read the appendix. And until then, bye.